I'm Crystal Euden. I'm Senior Legal Counsel in the credit team, and I'm here to talk to you about responsible lending. I thought I'd give you a heads up first. During my chat with you, I'm going to ask you to raise your hands if it's a yes or no, and just get some audience participation, so don't be too scared when I ask. It's generally not a yes or no question, although there might be one, but I think you'll know it when you hear it. I'm sure we all already know about the overarching principle with responsible lending, but just in case, let's start off with it. It is that every lender must exercise the care, diligence, and skill of a responsible lender when advertising, before agreeing to provide credit or finance or taking guarantees, and of course in all subsequent dealings with borrowers and guarantors. To assist lenders in complying with the overarching principle and the rest of the responsible lending principles, we of course have the non-binding responsible lending code. And I already mentioned, but responsible lending is a priority area for the Commission. We recently filed our first proceedings for irresponsible lending, and we anticipate making more decisions on enforcement outcomes by the end of this year. We know that lenders are already engaged in developing and implementing their own responsible lending compliance programs, but we also know from complaints, investigations, and our own market monitoring that not all lenders are doing so, and there's still some widespread potential non-compliance. So we are focused on checking and talking to lenders about these issues and taking appropriate enforcement action when we need to. We also encourage lenders to cross-check their own compliance and make sure that they're on the right track. The kinds of issues that we hear about are what we're focusing on, and there are three of them. At the moment, they are suitability, affordability, and understandability. Let's turn to suitability. Section 9C 3A1 of the CCCFA provides that lenders must make reasonable inquiries before entering into a loan or taking a guarantee to be satisfied that the credit provided will meet the borrower's needs and objectives. So suitability is about the inquiries that you're making about whether the loan is going to meet your borrower's requirements and objectives. We want to make sure that you're making proper assessments of the information that you get as a result of your inquiries as well. Affordability. Section 9C 3A2 provides lenders must make reasonable inquiries before entering into a loan or taking a guarantee to be satisfied that the borrower or guarantor will be able to make the payments under your loan or comply with the guarantee without suffering substantial hardship. Affordability is about whether the borrower is likely to be able to meet their obligations under the loan without suffering unforeseen substantial hardship. Without suffering substantial hardship. So these are the things that we can foresee before we give the loan. We're particularly concerned to make sure that lenders are actually making inquiries about both the borrower's income and expenses so that we're able to properly assess the ability to pay back the loan. Getting borrowers to text or email or tick a box that they can afford their loans is not going to be good enough. And lastly, understandability, bit of a funny word, but basically it's about assisting borrowers to reach informed decisions as to whether to enter into the agreement and to fully understand all of the bits and bobs that comes with it. We're often remembering that when borrowers come to borrow money from you, they're often focusing on what they need the money for, or they're focused on how best to get the application. They're generally not really in the right frame of mind to consider all the terms and conditions, your disclosure statement, and the various documents that you give them at the time. So what we want to see is that lenders help them with this, draw their attention to the most important aspects of the documents. For example, what happens if you miss a payment? Again, a tick box exercise, getting a borrower to tick or email or sign that they've read and understood the most important terms of the terms and conditions is not going to be sufficient. I like to see things as examples, so I thought what a better time than to go through a couple of them. And the first one we're going to talk about is Rob. Rob wants to buy a car from you. Rob wants to buy a car and you're going to lend him the money. He's seen a 2008 Holden Commodore that he simply has to have, and he needs $18,000. It's all good. He's got a $3,000 deposit and he suggests that he can probably pay back the loan at $150 a fortnight. His application's got a few issues. So he's a beneficiary. He does have a $3,000 deposit, but it's from a pre-approved loan from another lender. He owes money to other lenders. And there's more. The last 3 months of his bank statements shows on average he has no more than $5 left over after each fortnight beneficiary payment. His bank statements show several loan repayments, and they show him regularly going into overdraft to pay for groceries and utilities. Quick show of hands, now's the time. Who at this point thinks that they'd probably give the loan to Rob? This was the easy one. We think it's fair to say in this case that Rob is probably not going to be able to make the repayments under the loan without suffering substantial hardship. But that was an easy one, so let's look at a different one. This is about John. In this example, you provide high-cost credit agreements. Remember, high-cost credit agreements are defined in the Responsible Lending Code as agreements with an APR, an annual interest rate, of 50% or more. John is one of your regular borrowers. Since 2017, John has taken out a number of loans with you. He repaid his last agreement with you on time, and in fact, all of his agreements have been paid on time. He's applied now for a loan of $800 to be repaid after 30 days, and he needs it for a funeral. At this point, quick show of hands. Oh, wait, there's one more thing. You can't decide yet. I've got one more piece of information for you. Your internal credit score says that John can borrow $1,000. So he wants $800, but you think he can pay $1,000. At this point, who thinks they'd probably give John the loan? Some honest answers. Thank you. Yes, okay. Let's pretend you give John the loan. So there are already some warning bells there just on suitability, also affordability, but I'll come back to that. But at this point, there's some warning bells about suitability. Focusing on suitability, the first warning bell was that I told you that you're a high-cost credit lender. The code suggests that for high-cost credit lenders, you make more extensive inquiries in respect of suitability because there is a greater risk that the type of loan that you offer will not meet the borrower's requirements and objectives. So let's make those more inquiries. I've told you John is a regular borrower, but how many loans has he actually had? Let's have a look. So he's had 18 loans with you since January last year. It's a fair bit, so let's see how it looks. I'm not sure if you can see from the back, but we start with a loan of $200, and the most recent loan was for a loan of $750. As a lender, you're responsible for making sure that your type of loan is going to meet John's requirements and objectives, and that your $800 loan is going to meet John's requirements and objectives. The code suggests that high-cost credit lenders inform John that this type of credit should not be used for long-term borrowing because it's unlikely to be suitable for that purpose, and it's more likely to be more expensive than any other form of credit. We can see from the graph that John is clearly using the high-cost credit agreements as a form of regular borrowing. We can see that since January last year, John has never not had a loan with you. But hang on a second, John said that he needed the money for a funeral. That's not a long-term purpose. Well, lucky for us, we collect all the loan purposes in our automated system. Out of interest, who here uses automated systems to gather initial loan application information? Yeah. So lucky for us, it's in our system, so let's go and see what it says. It's a lot of funerals, right? So John is either the most unfortunate person in the world, or we've got a problem with our automated systems. So those issues could be your system is auto-populating the reason for the loan based on a previous loan, and we're not asking John to update it, or The system is auto-populating the reason for the loan based on the previous loan. We are asking John to update the loan purpose, but he's not doing it. Either way, because we're using an automated system, we have to make sure that it is robust and that we're auditing those processes. Part of those processes must be that we pick up anomalies like these and see that, at least for maybe the third or fourth funeral, that it probably wasn't a funeral. How can we responsibly make sure that the loan for $800 for a funeral is actually going to meet John's requirements and objectives when we're not even confident that it's for a funeral? Let's pretend that we can satisfy ourselves that this $800 loan for John is suitable. The next limb of inquiry that we're concerned with is affordability. Can John actually afford the loan? You might recall that I told you earlier that John's repaid his last agreement with you on time, and in fact has repaid all his agreements with you on time. John's a good guy. What if I told you John is borrowing immediately after paying his loan back? John repaid his loan with you this morning. Looking at his bank statements, John has always repaid his loan and then borrowed again on the exact same day. The bank statements show that John is going into overdraft to repay his loan and then borrowing again at a slightly higher amount to get back in the green. We would not expect a responsible lender, having looked at those statements, to satisfy themselves that in this case John is able to make the payments under the agreement without suffering substantial hardship. We asked for John's bank statements in January 2017, but we didn't use them, and we haven't asked for any since. So there's no point in us asking for information if we're not actually going to assess it. And furthermore, if we do ask for the information and we assess it, we need to make sure that we're also doing it for successive loans. Here, John has had 18 loans with us since January 2017, but we have only asked for bank statements for the very first loan. So our automated system and our processes didn't pick up that in July last year, John actually lost his job, and so he's been relying on repeated loans from us and other lenders ever since. The credit score we used for John was calculated based on a percentage of his income, but it did not take into account John's actual income circumstances. You'll recall that John first got his loan with us in January last year. At the time, John's income was partly made up of working tax credits, clearly an indicator, as many as 18 loans ago, that there's many mouths to feed in John's family and he already needs financial assistance. Furthermore, when John applied for his loan, he was a retail worker and he was working overtime at Christmas. A quick look at his bank statements will tell us that between December and February, John always makes about 1.5 times more than he does in any other month. In addition, John already had 2 loans when he first applied in January last year, and since then we don't know if he's had any other loans because our system is based on income and not expenses. Again here, the income-based credit score has let us down because it did not take into account John's actual circumstances. In the assessment of whether John could afford his loan, I never told you anything about his expenses. The Commission expects lenders to take into account expenses when considering affordability. How you do this is up to you. Here are some examples. We could ask John. We could have looked at John's bank statements, and/or we could have applied benchmarks. As I said, how you look into expenses is up to you, but you do need to take them into account, and you must be able to satisfy yourself that whatever process you're using is reasonably robust to comply with your obligations. So for example, if you're going to use benchmarks, we would expect that the benchmarks are current, are appropriate, and aren't contradictory to anything else that you know about your borrower. For example, if your benchmark is $75 for petrol, but John tells you directly, or his bank statement says that he spends $100 on petrol, then we would expect you to forget your benchmark of $75 and record $100. Further, we all know that the price of petrol is about to go up, so if your petrol benchmark's been about $50 for the last 5 years, you might want to consider reassessing that once we get our extra tax. It's the end of our time with John. John's been a good example of how we can use information not only gathered from the borrower, but also which are available in our own systems, for example, the many funerals, things that are available in bank statements that John wouldn't necessarily tell us, but which are available to us anyway. Lessons we can learn from John. These are lessons not just limited to high-cost credit lenders, they're lessons that any lender can learn from. The first one being, you can't rely on what John says if you knew or should have known better. So just because John said the loan was for a funeral doesn't mean it was. A very simple look back at information we already had available told us it probably wasn't for a funeral. And just because John clicked a box saying that he could afford the $800 loan didn't mean he could. Looking at John's bank statements would have shown constant overdrafts, paying off a loan, getting a new one every day, etc. So the key here is reasonableness. One of the lenders in Wellington raised a question. If a borrower tells you that they're living at home with their parents and they pay board at $100, nothing in the bank statements indicates otherwise. Is that enough, or is the lender meant to ask the parents, hey, does your son live at home? Does he pay $100 board? Our response is, as a lender, you're required to make reasonable inquiries. If the borrower tells you that they're paying $100 board, you're not aware of any other information that would contradict that. For example, the bank statements don't show regular withdrawals of $500 every fortnight, then that's probably okay to stop there. The Commission and certainly the legislation doesn't expect you to go and knock on the door, for example, to make sure that the borrower does live with his family or get a signed statement from the parents or something like that, unless, of course, you're aware of something that tells you otherwise, which could mean that you just stop the loan application there. You don't have to go door-to-door knocking. We need to ask questions and look into individual circumstances. So, for example, loss of income, loss of job, the change in working tax credits, etc. And we need to make sure that the loan type is suitable. Here we would have expected a reasonable lender to have discussed with John, whether that be by email, in person, if they operate face-to-face lending or on the phone, that high-cost credit agreements should not be used for long-term borrowing and that there are other forms of credit that might be more suitable, even if that means it's with a different lender. Again, this lesson is not just limited to high-cost credit agreements. Offering a fixed loan when what a debtor really needs is revolving credit, therefore locking themselves into a topping up cycle, again, probably wouldn't be suitable. And lastly, bank statements can be invaluable, but only if we're using them. They can show you things like constant overdrafts, other loan payments, dishonoured payments, and things like that. And there are often dead giveaways in them, but only if we're looking at them. Understandability. We expect lenders to assist borrowers to reach informed decisions and to be reasonably aware of the agreement's implications, particularly the big ones. Using our example of John's loan, when we gave John our $800 loan, we emailed him 5 different documents, including a disclosure statement and our usual terms and conditions. We expect responsible lenders to ensure that any documents provided to a borrower are capable of being understood by the target borrower. So, for example, if your lending market is predominantly Chinese, we would expect that a responsible lender would provide the key terms and conditions in both English and in Mandarin. We would also expect important information to be highlighted to borrowers. Depending on how you lend, this could be done, say, on pop-up boxes in an online lending environment, or if you're handing over some terms and conditions, you might have a front page that lists all the key terms and conditions, or in the document you might use colour, maybe not pictures, but colour, bolding, use all the available resources. And as with suitability assessments, we don't think it's enough to rely on a tick box, whether in person or online or however you lend, to satisfy yourself that the borrower has understood all the key terms and conditions. Here, John signed up to the loan online, and as part of the application, his electronic signature was automatically applied to a variety of documents, including a wage deduction authority. Again, we expect responsible lenders to ensure that borrowers are aware of the implications of all of the different things that they're signing up to. So for example, if you're going to ask for a wage deduction authority, we would expect you to have properly explained to John in these circumstances what the wage deduction authority is, when it's going to be applied, that his employer will probably be called, etc., before he enters into the loan. Use of automated systems. Kind of a quick show of hands here who uses them. We're seeing them a lot, and so we do somewhat regularly get asked what our view is on automated processes. The Commission's position is this. Automated systems are fine if they're reasonably robust and you're able to satisfy yourself that they're making the right assessments of suitability and affordability, and of course can identify vulnerable borrowers. Ensure that your systems are asking the right questions and that there are regular checks in place. So for example, conduct an audit, which I'll come to shortly. The more automated your processes are, the more care that must be taken to ensure that you've gathered sufficient information to properly assess affordability, particularly the current financial commitments of the borrower, the suitability of the loan product, and to identify a potentially vulnerable borrower. So how do we make sure that our systems are robust enough to meet our responsible lending obligations? My hope is one of the things that you take away from what I'm talking about is to conduct responsible lending audits. Regularly look at your own records and data and conduct an audit. For example, you could ask yourself, what percentage of loans in any given month were repaid in full in accordance with the loan terms, were repaid by a new loan or refinance, had missed or rearranged payments, had defaults, or were sent to collections. Answers to these questions should give you an idea on where there might be issues in your lending model that might need some tweaking or overhauling. So for example, if you audited your loan book for February of this year and you found that 90% of your loans were repaid in full in accordance with the agreement, but the follow-on inquiry was 75% of those were repaid with new finance or refinance, then there's probably an indicator there that you need to look at why so many of your loans are being refinanced. Is there an issue with affordability, for example? It could be that in all of those cases there were unforeseen circumstances, but for example 75% would be a pretty high question that we would expect you to go and have a look at. And I should clarify that these are questions that we have asked when we've gone and done market monitoring, and they have certainly provided us answers that made us go, oh, we might need to look at this a bit further. So I'm hoping that by sharing these questions you can use them to do your own checks. That's it now for responsible lending. As you may have heard, and as was mentioned earlier, we have recently filed our first proceedings for breaches of the responsible lending principles. So hopefully next time you hear one of us talk about responsible lending, we've got a bit more to say, and in particular what the courts have done with the responsible lending principles. I hope what I've said, or some of what I've said, has been useful. James is going to follow up with some more useful information on fees and disclosure. You might have questions after what I've said, and after what James says there will be time, so I look forward to them. Thank you.